Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to video number 68 and audio season 3, episode 33 of Music is Not a Genre. Each week I take a release or several from my collection. I discuss them, I give you my take on them, I throw in some interesting tidbits and facts and opinions, and I connect them to my music, to other music, and to other things in the world. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening and reading and clicking and listening again and reading again and subscribing and sharing, especially sharing. And for anyone who's a Patreon patron, thank you from the bottom of my heart. The more the merrier. This week, the topic is Death is Dumb, Volume 5, John Lennon, The End Started Here. So if you've been listening to my Death is Dumb series, my mini-series within the larger series, you know that it's basically reflecting on deaths in music that we consider to be tragedies. I would say whether they're mostly they're untimely, it's something, some element like that, and to discuss why that matters, how it impacts us, how it maybe even how it impacted the world, how it impacted music, and so forth. And this one is the, I mean, you could say that maybe about others, but for me, this is the monster. This is the monster. This is, as I said, it's about John Lennon. For those of you watching, you can see that I have 3 of his CDs here. Just a small selection from his solo output. That's all I've bought. Now, I've listened to everything, but that's what I've bought. And for those of you who are listening, who can't see, I have here Double Fantasy, Milk and Honey, and the John Lennon Collection. It's called just his kind of like a greatest hits thing, which has most of the hits and the really, really awesome songs. And I mean, one of the main reasons that this is kind of the mega for me, that I wrote down here that he is the patron saint of Death is Dumb, if not the whole reason it started. The whole reason it started, I would say, is because of, 2 things. One is when Adam Schlesinger of Fountains of Wayne and others things died last year unexpectedly. It really was devastating to me. And also, way back, I did a part of one episode on Lou Reed, because I was talking about albums that I had from the 1980s, collection, a few of them in that episode. And I don't think I said this on camera, but I wrote it in the text, the phrase "death is dumb," and it struck me as, yeah, that's what I'm going for here. That's the whole idea, and we talk about why that is. Agree or disagree, philosophers, but that's how I'm feeling. And so, yeah, this is a big one for me because the Beatles are still my number one, not just because of how much they've influenced me and the rest of the world, but because of how much I love their music as a listener, and their depth and breadth. But also because John Lennon died at a time when I was very impressionable, at a time when that part of my childhood was taken up with music, as was ever after. But my dad, being a musician and being into the Beatles from the very beginning of the Beatles, had their collection of all of their albums on vinyl, and we listened to them over and over and over. And throughout the 1970s, there was always talk of a reunion, and somebody would show up on somebody else's album and things like that. And I was awake. I was I was even at that age, I was 12, I was a night owl. And it was okay with my family to be a night owl because my dad, musician, would be out, till all hours of the morning doing his version of a day job. And was watching TV when the news broke in and talked about him being shot and eventually dying. And it was a sucker punch to the gut, to borrow a phrase from a recent article on Friends, but for a different reason. It really is. It awoke the feelings in me that I have been evoking in all of these volumes of Death is Dumb, which is that loss of hope, the loss of the potential future, the loss of more music and all of that stuff, and things that I've described. And if I'm able to articulate any of that in any effective way, it's because of what I felt the night that John Lennon died. But because this is such a momentous one, not that the deaths of, other people I've talked about, the Adam Schlesinger, as I mentioned, Scott Weiland of Stone Temple Pilots, Adam Yauch of the Beastie Boys, MCA, Lane Staley, Alice in Chains, and the several more that I have listed for upcoming volumes of Death is Dumb. They're all tragic. They all hit me in some way. That's why I talk about them. There are thousands of untimely deaths, and just in the music world alone over history. I'm not going to talk about all of them, not just because it's an unwieldy thing to do, but because they didn't all hit me in the same way. And doesn't mean they're not tragic, but there are people that I will not talk about that their death probably devastated you. And so you can consider who I'm talking about, people whose deaths hit me hard in some way that I felt. And one of the points I make about this is that, yes, we should mourn all of these deaths. We should mourn, what could have been and all of that. And for example, no Beatles reunion ever, as close as they came with those mid-90s recordings where they used the ghost of John's voice in some of his piano playing, I believe. Decent, but of course it can't be the real thing. And we should feel all of that, but we should also celebrate that the reason why this hurts so much is because of how passionate we are about music and the people who create music. And this is one of the reasons why I do all of this, but in particular why I do Death is Dumb, is to talk about the passion, to, quote REM. And this is a perfect time to kind of go more into the general idea of this mini-series that I do, because, here's one of the main reasons, I don't need to be a historian here. Other people who have researched more than I have, who are more obsessive about the details of a person's life story and the history of the minutiae of a band and all of that, have done a much better job of chronicling John Lennon's life and death than I have and I ever will. And I urge you to look up any of that stuff. Books and documentaries and such. There was one last year when it was the 40th, right? Yeah, 40th anniversary of his death and all of that. Look them all up, because the more you know, the better. I may touch on some of that here and there if I get into it. I really don't know. I like kind of flying off the cuff. But the point is, that's not why I'm doing this. I will certainly talk about quite a bit of his music and how, why it was so great and how it influenced me and all of that. But as far as the history and the death, Mark David Chapman and all of that, you can find all that out pretty much just by Googling, John Lennon or John Lennon death or whatever it is you want to know about. So instead, I thought I would devote a portion of this podcast, as I said, to talking about the general idea of this, the Death is Dumb series. And, this is, I don't usually do this I don't focus quite as much on the written word, the text that I write. I usually leave that as an alternative underneath the video or audio version of this. You may get more information with that. I urge you to read if you listen to any of my podcasts, read the text too, because it's something different. It's not a transcript, with some very, very few exceptions. But in this case, I do want to kind of look a little bit more at this text, because there are some things that I mentioned that I think would fly really well here on video and audio. And that, the main point being, as I mentioned, so many deaths that in music that it's not pertinent to count them or to talk about all of them. You can go back as far as Franz Schubert or Frédéric Chopin. I mean, stars in their day, in different ways, died tragically young, and so that's in the mid 19th century. I'm sure you can go back even farther. There were deaths, prior to that when, musicians were stars that were considered tragic. Mozart might be another great example. But even if we're sticking to the 20th and the 21st centuries, it's still a pretty damn long list. And pardon me as I pause to tell you that I live here in Astoria, New York City, which is a city, and it has various activities going on, one of which today happens to be construction. So you might hear, hopefully, just some faint, whispers of construction devices and things in the background. I apologize for that. Hopefully that you can focus in on my mellifluous tones instead, and that won't distract you. So anyway, 20th, 21st centuries, just focusing on those, there are a lot of tragic music deaths from let's even say from the 1950s on. You have, like, it's the first thing that comes to mind, and certainly not the first ever, as we're talking about, but the first that comes to mind is the big one, that the song was written for The Day the Music Died, Bye Bye Miss American Pie. No offense to anybody, not a favorite song of mine, but there are reasons for that maybe I'll get into in another podcast, or you can ask me and I'll tell you, comment. I love to hear your comments. But it memorialized that day in 1959, when that small charter plane in the middle of a tour with Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper crashed and killed them all. And that was a huge thing. These stars and rising stars just demolished in an instant. What is an interesting point is that the following year, this same rock and roll tour, my father, who was a rock and roll singer back in the 50s and 60s, and then a different kind of singer through the 70s and beyond, was on that tour. He did the same tour the year later with a bunch of other people, and in the U.S. and Canada and all of that stuff. Just kind of a neat little anecdote there. But I know that crash in '59 affected a lot of people, devastated a lot of people, certainly devastated the music world. And then, again, I'm skipping over a lot because you have to, but you have the infamous 27 Club. And sure, you can also have a 32 Club, I discovered, and God knows, pick a number, you could probably have a club there too. But it is pretty significant that so many well-known musicians died at the age of 27. And I did a little research and found a list that was over 75 items long, and went back as far as 1892 to musicians who died at the age of 27. But if you know it, we know it as kind of really taking shape in 1970 and 71, when Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison all died at the age of 27. That was just made such an impression on the world that I think that's kind of where it started. But the year before that, in '69, Brian Jones of the Stones died at the age of 27. And then skipping forward in time, you have Kurt Cobain, you have Amy Winehouse. And like I said, the list, it's over 75 people long. And, so any or many of those may have affected you and devastated you. There will be a couple of those that I will be talking about, in particular Kurt Cobain, in a future episode. Then, after the early 1970s, what's the big one? I mean, there were several in the 70s, tragedies. But what's the big one? 1977, Elvis. Not as young as some, but still, young-ish, middle-aged at most. Tragic, death. I was old enough to have remembered that instance, but because I was not as immersed in Elvis and wasn't as huge of a fan, it did not affect me the way others have, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. The following year, you have Keith Moon, and then you have John Bonham. I mean, these are two drummers, mega drummers for mega bands, just iconic drummers for iconic bands that died within a couple of years of each other, I believe. And right around that time, and they were both 32, by the way, that's where I came up with that number. Right around that time, you have the Leonard Skynyrd crash, which I watched a documentary a couple of years ago and did not realize that there were several people who survived that crash. So just think of the horror of all of that, the deaths and the survivors, what it did to the not just the people who died, but the people who lived, and the band itself, and the music moving forward, and all of that. In newer kind of music, Ian Curtis of Joy Division, kills himself because he was sick and depressed, and that band morphed into New Order and all of that, and of course Sid Vicious, and so kind of going along in that vein. But then you have Marvin Gaye, who was shot by his own father. Moving forward even more, you have Freddie Mercury, died of complications from AIDS, and then you have Selena, such a huge tragedy that movies have been made about it. Aaliyah, someone that was kind of shocking to me, even though again I didn't know much about her, really really young, and you have George Michael and people like that, and then the people I mentioned before that I've done episodes on, all the way up to when it really just started to blow up, when Bowie died in January 2016, and Prince died in April 2016, and then Chris Cornell of Soundgarden in 2017. And I'm going to be doing actually episodes, volumes on all of those three, for sure. Pretty sure Bowie, but absolutely Prince and Chris Cornell. And the point here is, that's a very small list. I mentioned or alluded to, if you count that list of 75 I mentioned, not even 100 people out of thousands. And what's the point, right? Death is death, loss is loss. People will die. They will die young. They will die old. They will die tragically. They will die of quote unquote natural causes. Well, the point is, what strikes a chord with you or with me is what matters. So when someone dies, and I've said this in other volumes here, but it bears repeating, whether it's someone you know or someone you identify with in some way, like a musician or an actor or someone else, a writer, if it hits you, it matters. It all matters. But if it hits you, it matters to you. And my hope here is that for other people who are fans of the people that I am talking about, have talked about, will talk about, fans of John Lennon in particular here, that these episodes will help us kind of mourn together and talk about it together, and express some of our even emotions about it, and certainly our thoughts. Like I said, the immediate loss of the future, of possibility, of reunion, of renewal, of hope, the taking away of a vibrant, creative, and an existential energy, the finality of it all. When you're talking about somebody who, even let's say, we know John Lennon was getting to another part of his career when he was going to start to create like crazy. I mean, let's talk about, while we're here, a little bit of the music. So he put out some solo stuff before the Beatles even broke up, but then blew up when he put out Imagine in 1971. He had a decent run through 75, and then he took a break for many reasons, one of which is he had another son, Sean, who was a great musician in his own right, as is Yoko. And let me just say right here for the record, anybody who feels like rehashing old crap about anybody really, but in particular about John or Yoko or the Beatles or any of that, put it in the comments. Go ahead. But I am going to categorically disagree with all of it, because I think that is the opposite of connection. It's division. And a great majority of it is bullshit, and it's misogyny. But that's a side note anyway. After 75, he took a break from music and jumped back in like crazy in 1980. He claimed, partly because of the album that Paul put out at the time, and one of his hit songs, Coming Up, and I think that was the one that kind of spurred him on to say, oh well, he's doing great. I actually like that he's doing. I'd like to do some of that myself, and had been, I'm sure, writing anyway. Started recording here in New York, where he lived for quite a bit of his late life. I can't tell you how many times I've passed by the Dakota building and passed by where Yoko still lives and all of that, and been down around where Sean lives, and living here in New York, a lot of legends here. And as you may know, and like I said, I won't get too much into this. Walking home from recording session, Mark David Chapman was actually a so-called fan who a guy I believe got even an autograph from him earlier. I think that day or the day before. Like I said, not a historian, and then shoots him, etc., etc., and he dies. Like I said, I still can barely go through it. Anyway, before he died, not only did he finish this album here for you listeners out there, I am holding up in front of the Beatles Complete Scores book, the album. Oh, sorry, no, that's right, they're in the right order. I just picked up the wrong one. Double Fantasy, which was partly called that because Yoko's a contributor here, and there are songs of hers on here, etc., etc. This was released, I think, before his death, and Starting Over was the big hit there. But the B-side of that was Kiss Kiss Kiss, which when I was a kid scared me. But listening back to it, I'm like, this is a damn good post-punk song. It's a really cool punk song. Gimme Something, I like I'm Losing You. I love that song. Everybody Loves Beautiful Boy. Watching the Wheels, another big one. Woman, excellent song. And Walking on Thin Ice, I actually really like that song too. And I think this is a reissue, so because it has Central Park Stroll dialogue on here and stuff like that, and there's some great pictures in here, but you can find them online. But while he was doing this Double Fantasy session, he did a whole bunch of other songs that were not finished or released, but were close enough to being finished that a few years after his death, they released another album called Milk and Honey, which for you listeners here, I'm holding up. And I remember being so psyched when it came out, and also really loving it. And this was right around when Julian Lennon had a couple of hits, like Too Late for Goodbyes, and I forget what the other one is. And so hearing his voice and how uncanny it was that at the time he sounded a lot like his father. And then this album comes out, and I want to say this was 1984. But again, please don't quote me on that. I was so pleased to hear the new songs because I thought that had John been alive, he would have made another impact on 1980s popular music. And this was kind of his way of doing that, and the people who were, curating his legacy, like Yoko, of helping him to do that when, of course, he couldn't. And it's partly because there are some songs on here that I actually think are some of my favorites of his that I thought should have been on the John Lennon collection. But are not, and I'm Stepping Out. That's the opening track. It's a fun one, but the one that I loved and still love is the song Nobody Told Me. Nobody told me there'd be days like these, strange days indeed, most peculiar, Mama. Is a song that I plan to cover at some point, both live and probably in recording, because again, it's not the one you would think, oh, cover a John Lennon solo song. Everybody does Imagine or Mother or, so many of his other great songs, which I'll get to in a sec. But this is one where I'm like, oh no, people need to hear more of this because it's a bouncy, fun song, but it also has some wisdom to it and some cool lyrics. And I think his performance is great. So it's, again, all I'm saying is look up all of his stuff, but don't forget Milk and Honey. It's a worthy album. And then you get to, let's just talk about some of his big singles. John Lennon collection, yes, Give Peace a Chance, Instant Karma. I, love the slapback reverb on that. Power to the People, I actually like even better than Give Peace a Chance. Whatever Gets You Through the Night, I believe was a thing where, and I want to say it was Elton John, and they had this kind of fake rivalry where Elton was like, if you, or I forget, John was like, if you get a number one, I'll record a number one and you'll sing with me or something. I forget. Okay, sorry. And it did go to #1, and it's got a blazing sax solo on that. Mind Games is cool. Happy Xmas, yep. And Imagine, Jealous Guy, all these famous ones. See, they don't even have Mother on here. Stand By Me, his cover of the Ben E. King song. Starting Over, of course, and Woman, and I'm Losing You from his last album, Beautiful Boy, and Watching the Wheels from his last album, and Dear Yoko. Cold Turkey is the last one on here, and I think it should be the first because it's one of my favorites. And when I do my tribute concert to the Beatles solo work, the 2 Lennon songs I've chosen to do are Cold Turkey and Nobody Told Me. And it's just such a warm and cool song all at once, and it's just one of those like deceptively simple songs, absolutely worth looking up. Also, don't forget that he was part of David Bowie's song Fame, among other collaborations. And that song was cool already just because it's a cool song and because it's Bowie, but it's even cooler because they did it together. Yeah, and that's my talk on JL, on John Lennon. I want to talk a little bit about, as always, the influence here, and sure, he influenced me, and let's even set aside the Beatles, which are a huge influence on my work, whether you can hear it or not. The thing about Lennon, as juxtaposed with McCartney, as they always do, although they're equal geniuses in my book, just different, is that they always said he was rawer and more honest. And I've said before that I think it's possible to be honest and deep in a pop song that's polished. Okay, but delving into John Lennon's work and his ability to create pop songs that were both raw and personal, very personal and personally honest, that's something that I've always gone for. The rawness, not always, but that personal honesty, and especially the plain spokenness in the lyrics, that is huge for me. Everything that I have written in the last God knows how many years, that's my, to be able to have a musical and lyrical impact, but do it in a way that doesn't have to be overbearing or floridly poetic or in some way, meaningful in quotes, kind of hyper meaning and all of that, is not for me. His ability to throw almost, confessional, yes, but kind of diary-like lyrics out there and yet craft them in a way that they came together to form awesome pop and rock songs is something that I go for all the time. And you can hear that in a lot of what I do, but especially in a slightly older song, Some Things Happen from Parts and Labor, link below, also on every single streaming service and at recarea.bandcamp.com. And then a more recent song from the album Sympathy for the Weird, Lost Found. Those are very personal lyrics and very plain-spoken lyrics. I think you'll get a sense of what I mean when you listen to that. That's my band Rec. These are songs I have written, and I always appreciate you diving in both to the artists that I talk about and to the music of my own that I talk about. Do you remember Lennon's death at the time? Remember what you were doing, as they say often with John Kennedy's death? Did it hit you? Did it hit you in the way that it hit me? Were there other musicians that hit you harder? Their death hit you harder? The cult of Elvis and even Bob Marley and people like that. Are there other musicians whose deaths devastated you the way John Lennon's devastated me? I want to know all of this. I want to hear your comments. I want to know what you agree or disagree with, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for listening and watching and reading and clicking and sharing, and I'll talk to you next time.